O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts in this place, may they be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, several years ago, when I was serving another church, the staff and I decided it was time to start a new family ministry. And our goal was to honor the diverse group of families that were making our church their home. Some of the families had kids and some were without kids, and we wanted to harness their energy, So I came up with a brilliant idea to embark on a study of the many iconic families in the Bible, to see what we can learn from them, right? And then I was a bit naive, because when you read about these iconic families of the Bible and how they treat each other, yikes. Like, for example, Adam and Eve, right away being tricked into eating the forbidden fruit, hiding from God in shame, and getting the boot out of the Garden of Eden, messing up a good situation for humanity, right? Or the brothers, their sons, Cain and Abel, spilling blood due to jealousy. Jacob scheming to steal his brother Esau's birthright. Joseph's brothers selling their youngest brother into slavery. Or King David having a warrior killed so he can marry the warrior's wife. I could go on. It was not my greatest insight as a pastor in that plan, because each week we read these stories and we look at each other and say, well, I guess the lesson is not to be like them, right? Or to wonder, I wonder what these families would have been like if they had access to therapy. I wonder how the story of the Bible would go. And yet, as time goes on, and I learn more about each other, and I look at my own family, and I hear stories about the reality of the life that we live, and I realize more and more that the broken and cruel, dysfunctional families of the Bible are not that distant from our own families and our own world. Genesis 1 begins the story of the Bible with the life-giving power of God, who joyously creates all that we see and experiences and calls it good. And then human beings take over and we mess things up with our dysfunction, our egos, our desire for more. Some of us have had the chance to grow up in families that tried their best to break those cycles that we often inherit from our families' poor choices and pain. But some of us didn't have that chance at all, and we carry with us the weight of our parents and our grandparents, multiple generations of pain. No one's family is perfect or without pain in our past. And when we're not able to deal honestly with those cycles and heal from them or chart new ways forward, we stunt our ability to be whole, to grow into our fullness, to love as deeply as we can, and we often pass it on to those in our care. One way researchers label this kind of pain is trauma. You may have heard that spoken about a lot more in research and in the news lately. The American Psychological Association describes trauma as an emotional response to a terrible event, like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. People who have experienced any kind of disruptive event carry trauma with them, whether they're a victim of a crime or a refugee family forced to flee their homeland. Sometimes the event that causes trauma isn't even that big. It can be a moment when we feel powerless or isolated. Perhaps our invitation then this morning as we continue our narrative journey through the Bible is to think about our families and the families we read about in the Bible as those who carry trauma. Maybe there's an invitation for us to be real about what we carry with us into the sanctuary this morning or into our online worship. And wonder then how we can be a church and a people of faith that create spaces where others can truly heal, where we can truly heal. What kind of trauma did Abraham carry with him in this challenging, complex passage from Genesis? In Genesis chapter 21, we are reminded that Isaac was Abraham and Sarah's first son. But of course, Isaac was not Abraham's first son. Lots of drama in this story. After being promised by God that they would have a child, even in their old age, Abraham and Sarah were in their 90s, waiting and believing in this promise that God was going to give them an heir. The two get impatient, and they craft a plan where essentially Abraham is given permission to rape Sarah's slave Hagar, and in order to give Abraham this son. And I'm not sugarcoating this story at all. Hagar was a slave of Sarah, and so she did not have a choice in this situation. Hagar was pregnant and gave birth to Ishmael, a boy. And then when Isaac comes along, when finally Sarah becomes pregnant, Sarah sees the two boys playing together and gets jealous, and then demands that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away. In Genesis chapter 21, verse 11, we learn that Abraham is distressed by this because he loves these boys of his. And this choice he's being given, he's being asked to do, it's called by some researchers moral injury. When you have deeply held values, but are asked to do something that betrays those values. Or you're asked to hurt someone that you love. Maybe by being asked to send Ishmael and Hagar away, a choice that we read God supports, Abraham knew. He knew that he was committing them to an early death, or at least a life of crushing poverty. Fast forward to chapter 22, and while Abraham suddenly faces another unimaginable ask for a parent from God this time. Take your son Isaac up the mountain and sacrifice him as a burnt offering. We are told that this is a test of faith by God. And what does Abraham do in response to that? Well, Abraham is silent. He doesn't argue with God or ask for an alternative. We don't even get the same kind of line that we did in the chapter before, that Abraham was distressed by what God was telling him. Abraham, without also apparently saying a word to Sarah, seems ready to fulfill another painful ask from God. Now, from my perspective as a parent, I know I would question God. And we see examples of folks like Abraham himself or Moses or Job throughout the Bible who question God, who push back. Why didn't Abraham do that? Why didn't he at least say, aren't you the life giver? Why would you want me to sacrifice my child that I waited all this time for you to give me? Are you okay, God? God, what's going on? Or maybe, as the text suggests, Abraham trusted God completely. Maybe he understood that this was another moment where he knew God was going to come through like God had before, and how God had by blessing them with Isaac in their old age. But you can still have strong faith and argue with God sometimes. Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, in her blog about this story, makes a strong case that Abraham's choices, as puzzling as they can be, point to his own trauma that he carried with him up on that mountain. Maybe, as Rabbi Ruttenberg wonders, Abraham was taught by his own father some bad parenting skills. According to Jewish legend, this is an interesting story, Abraham's father threw Abraham into a fiery furnace when Abraham acted out. And Abraham was only saved by the miraculous intervention of God. But what does that do to someone who grows up in that kind of family situation? Maybe the gift of sending Ishmael away into the desert was eating away at Abraham. Maybe he believed he wasn't a good parent, that he was a failure. Maybe Abraham believed that children were expendable, that if God brought him Isaac, that God would bring him another. Maybe he thought being a father was about being strong and not showing weakness and doing what you were told. I think we all know some parents who believe that. Or maybe it was a price he was willing to pay. God had promised him land and many descendants, and whatever it asked or required of Abraham, he wanted that promise. He wanted to be known as the father of nations. So whatever you ask God, as long as you carry out your end of the deal. How many of us have known a parent or two who are willing to sacrifice their children's lives and well-being in pursuit of that bigger thing in their mind? Fame, success, wealth, independence, stability. We have parents even right now who are willing to sacrifice their children's health by fighting against mask mandates in order to show their supposed devotion to God. Rabbi Ruttenberg says in her post, in order to do better, dream bigger, offer more to the generations to come after us, we must get clear about what we're truly carrying. We must be willing to admit to ourselves how we've been burned and how it's impacted us. We must be willing to do healing work for our own selves, our own lives, and for the future, so that we do not pass our pain on, whether to our children, our mentees, or anyone else we're helping to bring forward into the next chapter of life, work, and vision for the future. When Abraham and Isaac are on top of that mountain, the climax for me is verse 10, when Abraham takes that knife out, prepares to kill his son. And at that last minute, an angel of the Lord seems to reach out and stay Abraham's hand. Suddenly there is an alternative, a ram in the thicket, a ram in the bushes. Throughout this whole story, seeing is emphasized from Abraham repeatedly saying, "Here I am," to the intricate details that place us on that footpath up the mountain, to the name God is given as the Lord provides, or the one who sees. Maybe God saw, too, in Abraham a man who was willing to trust God, but also one who needed healing of his own, who needed a miraculous intervention to break a cycle of parenting and trauma in his own life, an alternative way. Let's admit that many of us here today are carrying trauma as well, just like Abraham on the way up that mountain. Maybe we too are in need of God's intervention in our life. In an article from Ministry Architects called "They're Not Coming Back," the author makes clear that it's time the church accept that we are traumatized people and move to address that. The author says, for each and every one of us, all at once during this pandemic, our world stopped. And now every single person, from the ones present to the ones we claim to miss to the ones we don't even know yet, everyone is recovering from a shared trauma. So many churches are shifting to become more trauma-informed, from paying attention to the pain of church members that we bring with us, especially in this pandemic, to creating safer spaces where people who do not want to be touched or ridiculed or singled out are made welcome, or special services that are quieter and provide time to rest in God's presence. Faith communities have a role in addressing this trauma for good or bad. And being a real church is among them. Learning how to have healthy and honest conversations about what we carry with us. Giving us permission to push back against God when God seems to ask the impossible of us. Encouraging one another to make use of counselors and therapists. I wonder what things that we are already doing in our own church that we should bring out a little bit more for those who are carrying great trauma. And I'm wondering what things we need to learn, what new skills God is calling us that might make a difference in this community. And I wonder what things you are carrying with you on your way to this holy place. What things you might feel shame and guilt for. What broken silos you are finding it difficult to break. How can your church help you find healing? Where's the good news of our text this morning, of our scripture? This messy and painful story is that God uses dysfunctional families who know and live amidst pain, trauma, and loss. The story of God intersects not with perfect people who have their life all together and always makes the right choice each and every day. The story of God intersects with people like us and our neighbors. We find God leading us to that mountain of faith, walking in the shadow of the valley of death, trying our best to trust and believe that in the chaos and confusion of it all, God sees us and God will provide. But that's the good news, that God does see our pain and God desires to deliver us. But at the end, there is possibility always for another way in this journey with God. There is a gift of waiting. There's a gift waiting for us, caught in the thorny bushes when we least expect it. God will indeed provide, even in the midst of impossible situations. God sees us and God reaches out to enfold us, even being willing to come to us, to send his Son to walk alongside us, to pour out life into our life. Thanks be to God.